I guess the best place to start is the beginning. I'm not going to drone on about every tedious event of every year. I'm going to be honest. I remember very little from the first 8 years of my life. I was born in New York. I remember the staircase where my older brother Charles and I threw little parachute men off the banister while my father watched the news with his back to us. I remember the toy I played with in the driveway that belonged to my neighbors. I remember the walk we took down the road in the stroller in my sister's bedroom, a large closet painted pink. I remember my mother crying over a load of ruined clothes because she had washed a black crayon with a laundry. The dryer had melted wax all over the machine and the clothes. That day taught me never to wash children's clothes without checking the pockets first. I think I was 4. Her mother was there. It was the only time I ever saw her mother leave the dump of a trailer where she festered. My mother was Irish and had a sliver of Egyptian in her. O'Lundy and Flanagan were the family names. I don't know much about her family. In fact, I know almost nothing. My mother was, and is, a chronic liar. Don't get me wrong, I love my mother, but I don't believe a word that has ever left her mouth. My mother was beautiful, but insecure, and she boosted her lack of confidence with boasting and bragging. Every story was embellished, every truth exaggerated. The rule with my mother is simple: believe nothing. My mother was, to say the least, messed up. From my earliest memories, the signs were there. Her punishments were random, unpredictable, and at times unusually cruel. My half-brother Sean would receive the brunt of those fits, and more time than not she humiliated him to such a degree that it left him scarred. Most of the time she exercised the classic discipline from the early 19th century: bend over and hold the chair while I spank you with a belt. She was the mother who literally washed our mouths out with a bar of laundry soap. I grew up with my mother threatening to spoon-feed us castor oil. I think we were the only children in the school who knew what castor oil was. But it wasn't the punishments she doled out that groomed my siblings and I into what we would become. It was the constant, dedicated lack of support and complete absence of physical touch. My mother made sure we were clean, cared for, and beautiful. My brothers had suits. My sisters and I were dressed as porcelain dolls with curls, petticoats, and pinafores, and saddle shoes. And I don't remember a single hug. Ever. What little I remember, in a way of affection, was too boldly overshadowed by her rage, her anger, her screaming, her reprimands. My father was a by-the-book kind of guy. According to his religion, he was to go to work and bring home the bacon, while the wife cooked, cleaned, and mothered children. The only time my father stepped in was when we deserved an extra hard spanking. We went to church on Sundays and Saturdays and Wednesdays. Yes, we were well-behaved children. Yes, we were manicured into perfect ladies and gentlemen. My mother would have it no other way at any cost. I remember very little of my father from those days. I remember when I was 4, we were camping and a recent spanking had left a bruise on my leg. My father never spanked me or my sister ever again after that. I remember that camping trip well, though. We went to one of the many state parks and, oh, we swam beneath the falls. I love the forests of New York. The water and gorges, oh, the trails. More on that in a moment. I could talk for hours on the forests of New York. A few years later, we moved to a larger house that I had no memory of then. When I turned 8, we moved into the ranch. Town was an isolated village with a population of 1,050 and was 15 minutes away. We had 2 traffic lights, we lived on a dirt road, and the ranch-styled house sat in a clearing. I remember that day very well. Not the house, but the forest. Stretches of woodland area that went on for days behind the house. All around me were hills and mountains covered in endless forest. Barefoot I would run to the trees and play. For hours I would explore the wood. The forest was old, so very old. You could tell there were places where no men had entered in centuries, if ever. There was a peace there, a refined ancient peace, preserved from society, electricity, and people. Electricity is loud, did you know? When we were at power outages, the peace from the forest would seep in and blink at the house in perfect, beautiful silence. Those were my happiest days. 100 years ago, there had been a road that cut through the wood. An old wagon trail still remained. Moss and grass had grown over it. Streams flowed across it, shaping it into an old path through the wood. I always stayed from the path. I would climb into those woods and find little newts, the beautiful little red ones with black spots. They're endangered. I would love them, carefully pick them up, pat their tiny heads, and return them to their streams and beds of moss. I visited them often. I knew they were precious. I missed them. I remember little from that time, only the forest. I remember when the screams got loud. I would run barefoot into the wood and find my newts. I named the trees and followed the streams to the gorge. How I love the gorge. If you've ever seen central New York, you'll know it's all hillside. Everything is at a constant 45 to 65 degree slope. Houses and farms were built on the occasional slot of not-so-flat land. The wagon trail in the woods was on a rare layout of farmable land, flanked by sheer drop-offs, massive slopes, and plummeting gorges. This was my playground, and oh, how I used it. I had this one spot in the forest mastered where I could jump on the leaves, slide for 3 feet, snag a branch, and slingshot myself around and bolt, hopping and sliding, surfing the hills on leaf litter into the gorge. I would end my dance at a jump into the shallow streams with my skirts hiked up to my thighs. That was my home. That was where I wanted to be more than any place in the world. The stream continued down to the river, the Teeter. Some summers we would swim in that river. It was so beautiful. The streams that trickled down the mountains cut through the shale and earth, leaving behind massive walls of slate and stone that cradled streams and waterfalls. One stream formed the gorge. The gorge had walls nearly 30 feet high. I would climb them in my skirts, stand at the ledge, and gaze down at the deer with their fawn. Up there with the wind and the trees, I found me. I could slip so easily into the elements and feel them move through me. It felt like I could really fly and wanted so badly to jump, to try. Self-preservation, and Darwin said otherwise. I could see the rows of waterfalls, and upon my descent I would strip off my dress and swim naked in the pools of cool, clear water. I crossed rivers and streams, hopping barefoot from stone to stone. There, in my glen, I was home. That is the only happiness I remember. Life on the ranch was quite the opposite. Life on the ranch was hell. Together my parents had 4 children: Charles, myself, Marie, and Eugene. The year we moved into the ranch, our half-brother Sean moved in. Sean was my father's son from his first marriage, and my mom hated him. My mom was a screamer. The screaming was relentless. There were always noise. If we fell and got scraped, my mother screamed and coldly reassured us that we were fine, as if she was annoyed that we bled at all. There was no hug, no kiss, no contact. At night, we watched TV. My sister sat snuggled into my father's lap while I sat on the floor as far from everyone as I could. No one touched me. I was fine with that. I don't think I would have known what to do with it if I did. I remembered seeing Marie, her thumb in her mouth, her head resting on my father's shoulder. I remember wishing I wanted it. I pined, so I hated. I never said anything. Children should be seen and not heard, was verbally beaten into us. You didn't speak, you didn't ask, you didn't talk. I turned my thoughts back to the TV. TV. That was a memory I had. The TV was precious, and when it was on, we were not to speak to our father, and it was on from the moment he came home from work to the moment we sat down to dinner to the time we went to bed. The TV was more important than us. My father loved it more than me. It was one of the first lessons I learned, and I learned this lesson well. I detested the TV. It was a 5th sibling who absorbed all my father's love and attention. I was jealous. I loathed it. Dinner was the only time I had ever had with my father. Again, we were not to speak. Oh, but my father did. Every meal he made his rounds. He'd start with my half-brother Sean and would spend 15 minutes telling him how worthless he was, how selfish and miserable he was. He moved on to Charles and repeated the lecture. Then it was my turn. I would slip food in my mouth and I'd hear the words, "You're selfish, ungrateful, and spoiled." I'd swallow. "You only think of yourself." I spooned food into my mouth and flanked by tears. "You don't spend any time with the family." It hurt to swallow. My stomach tightened. I lost my appetite, and I stopped eating. "You only ever think of yourself." He went on to my sister. She was 5 at the time. Eugene was 2. He got skipped. The next night the routine repeated itself. My father would drive in. "Go to your rooms," my mother would say. "You know your father doesn't want to see you." We scattered, knowing we would be scolded if seen. I'd steal a peek. He kissed my mother, and after changing out of the work clothes, he turned on the TV and watched. My mother called, and we'd sit in silence at the dinner table while my father made his rounds again. "You're selfish and spoiled." I'd spoon food into my mouth. "You care only for yourself and shut everyone out." I'd swallow and the tears would fall. "You're ungrateful and spoiled." My stomach would clamp, and I wouldn't eat. You're useless and rotten and spoiled. His words became a recording that plays in my head to this day, every time I try to eat.